Dorothy Shepard found it at dawn, when the sky was the color of a bruise healing at the edges, purple fading to the pale gold of something almost forgiven. She had not slept. She had sat in the wooden chair by the window all night with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set like iron, listening to the wind move through the prairie grass and thinking about the kind of choices that leave permanent marks on a person. She was thinking, specifically, about the choice she had made 3 weeks ago when she had told Micah Dawson to ride out and not come back. She had meant it when she said it. She was less certain now. The carved wooden horse sat on the porch railing like a small, impossible miracle. It was no bigger than her fist, shaped from what looked like pale cottonwood, and whoever had made it had taken extraordinary care. The mane was carved in individual strands. The legs were mid-gallop, all 4 hooves off the ground, frozen in a moment of pure freedom. Around the neck, tied with a thin strip of leather, was a folded piece of paper. Dorothy's hand shook when she picked it up. She had told herself she was done shaking over Micah Dawson. She had told herself that the first week after he left, crying into her pillow when her sister Clara was asleep in the next room. She had told herself that the second week, when she caught herself looking toward the eastern ridge every time she heard hoofbeats. She had told herself that the third week, when the loneliness had turned from a sharp pain into something low and constant, like a wound that refused to close properly. The note said only, "I never lied to you about the things that mattered. I am sorry about the rest." The horse is so you remember that some things, once they know how to run, cannot be made to stop. It was signed with a single letter, M. Dorothy pressed the note against her chest and closed her eyes and stood on that porch in the cold dawn air of the Texas panhandle, in the year of our Lord 1879, and she made a decision that would change the entire shape of her life. She was 24 years old and she had buried a husband and raised a homestead mostly on her own, and survived a drought and a cattle sickness and a winter cold enough to crack stone. And she had done all of it with her chin up and her eyes open, and her heart carefully, deliberately shut. Micah Dawson had been the first thing in 4 years that had made her want to open it again. And she had driven him away with both hands because she was terrified of what that meant. She looked east, toward the ridge where the sky was beginning to burn gold. And then she went inside, put on her good dress, and started to saddle her horse. To understand how Dorothy Shepard came to be chasing a drifter across the Texas panhandle at sunrise, you have to understand what her life had looked like before he arrived in it. You have to understand the land first, because the land shaped everything else. The Shepard homestead sat on 320 acres of flat grassland north of the Canadian River, in a part of Texas that was still raw and unfinished in the way that new country always is. The sky was enormous there. It pressed down on a person in a way that could feel either like freedom or like suffocation, depending on the day and the weight a person was already carrying. Dorothy had learned, in the 4 years since her husband James had died of a rattlesnake bite in the summer of 1875, to mostly see it as freedom. It was a decision she had to make fresh every morning. James Shepard had been a good man. Solid and dependable and kind in the way that men who work hard with their hands tend to be kind, quietly and without performance. He had loved Dorothy with a steady, uncomplicated love, and she had loved him back, and when he died she had grieved him genuinely and deeply, and then she had done what frontier women do. She had kept going. Her sister Clara had come out from Missouri to help. Clara was 2 years younger than Dorothy, 22 years old in the autumn of 1879, with dark hair and a quick temper and a laugh that could fill a room. She had come planning to stay for 1 season and had stayed for 4 years, because the truth was she loved the land as much as Dorothy did, even if she would never have admitted it back in Missouri. Together, the 2 women ran a cattle operation that was modest by the standards of the big Texas ranches, but impressive by any other measure. They had 40 head of longhorns, a barn that Clara had helped Dorothy rebuild after a lightning fire, a kitchen garden, chickens, 2 horses, and a reputation in the nearest town of Calder Creek, 12 miles south, for being capable and independent in a way that made some men uncomfortable and some men respectful. Dorothy had become accustomed to both reactions. She had not become accustomed to the loneliness that lived underneath all the capability, quiet and persistent as a drought that takes its time. Micah Dawson had ridden onto the property on a Thursday afternoon in late September, trailing dust and trouble in the particular combination that Dorothy would later recognize as his signature. He was leading a horse that had gone lame, and he was bleeding from a gash along his jawline that he seemed to have forgotten about, and he asked at the gate whether he might water his animals and himself and be on his way. Dorothy had looked at him with the careful, measuring look she had developed over 4 years of managing a homestead alone, the look that sorted men quickly into categories of useful, harmless, and worth watching. Micah Dawson had not fit cleanly into any of those categories, which was itself interesting. He was perhaps 28 or 29, though it was sometimes hard to tell with men who spent most of their time outdoors, weathered and sun-darkened in the way that drifters got. He was lean and broad-shouldered, and he moved with the particular economy of motion of a man who had learned to conserve himself for the long distances. His eyes were a complicated gray-green that reminded Dorothy of the sky before a storm that could not make up its mind about what kind of storm it wanted to be. And there was something behind those eyes that she noticed immediately, a quality that she could not immediately name, something watchful and careful, and more intelligent than his road-dusty appearance suggested. She had told him he could water his horses, and she had brought him a cloth for the cut on his jaw, and she had not, technically, invited him to stay for supper. And yet somehow when Clara rang the bell at 6 o'clock, Micah Dawson was still there, sitting on the fence post watching the longhorns in the low gold light, and Dorothy had said gruffly that he might as well eat since it was getting dark. It was the most uncharacteristic thing she had done in 4 years. Clara had raised her eyebrows across the supper table in a way that communicated entire paragraphs without a single word. Dorothy had chosen to ignore those eyebrows entirely. Over supper, which was beans and salt pork and cornbread, because Dorothy was practical even when she had unexpected guests, Micah Dawson had spoken carefully and not much. He answered questions directly and did not offer information beyond what was asked, which Dorothy recognized as the manner of a man with things in his past he preferred to keep there. He said he had come up from the Rio Grande country and was heading generally north without a specific destination in mind. He said he had skills with horses and carpentry, and he was not afraid of hard work. He said these things simply, without selling them. It was Clara who asked whether he might stay on for a few weeks to help with the autumn work, because the fence on the north pasture needed repairing before winter and the barn needed a new roof section, and 2 women alone could only do so much. Clara said all of this looking at Dorothy rather than Micah, communicating in that sister language that Dorothy should not argue about it. Dorothy had looked at Micah Dawson across her own supper table and felt something she had not felt in 4 years, a small, dangerous warming in her chest, and had said yes in a voice that she made deliberately flat and businesslike. That was the beginning. And like all beginnings that matter, it contained within it the seeds of everything that came after, including the terrible misunderstanding that had driven them apart 3 weeks ago, and the carved wooden horse that had brought Dorothy out into the dawn to saddle her own horse and chase him across the prairie before she lost her nerve. Micah Dawson had spent his first 2 weeks on the Shepard place being useful in a way that was almost aggressive. He repaired the north fence. He replaced the damaged roof section on the barn, working from before sunrise until after dark, and he did it well, with the kind of craftsmanship that came from a man who took pride in the work itself rather than in being seen doing the work. He gentle-handled Dorothy's lame horse, a copper-colored mare she called Penny, back to soundness with a patience and skill that made Dorothy stop and watch from the barn door more than once. He was quiet in the evenings. He would sit on the porch after supper with a piece of wood in his hands and a small folding knife, carving things, small careful things, animals and shapes, and once a tiny bird that he had left on the porch rail without comment and that Clara had exclaimed over and kept. He never asked Dorothy personal questions. He never pushed. He was there, consistently and solidly, in the way that the fence posts were there, doing their job without demanding recognition for it. And Dorothy, who had spent 4 years building careful walls around herself, found those walls developing small cracks, not from any dramatic assault, just from the steady, patient pressure of his presence. It happened slowly and then all at once, the way things do. It was a Sunday morning in mid-October, 3 weeks after he arrived. Dorothy had gone out early to check on a heifer that had been showing signs of difficulty, and she had found Micah Dawson already in the barn, kneeling beside the animal, talking to her in a low voice that Dorothy could not quite make out. The lantern light fell across his profile, the strong jaw and the serious mouth and those complicated eyes soft, now with a concentration that was almost tender. And Dorothy had stood in the barn doorway with the cold morning air on her back and felt something inside her simply give way. She had gone back inside before he saw her. Later that morning, when he came in for breakfast, she had been sharp with him about something trivial, a plate left in the wrong place, and the look he gave her was so carefully contained, so deliberately without accusation, that she felt the sharpness curdle inside her into something more like shame. After breakfast, he had gone back out to his work, and Dorothy had sat at the kitchen table and admitted to herself, privately, and with a reluctance that felt like pulling a splinter, that she was falling in love with Micah Dawson, a man she knew almost nothing about, a man who had a dark past he kept locked somewhere behind those gray-green eyes, a man who had ridden in from nowhere and would likely ride back to nowhere when the work was done. It was not a comfortable admission. Dorothy Shepard was not a woman who fell in love carelessly. She had loved James, and James had died, and the lesson she had taken from that was not that love was dangerous, but that it was expensive in a way that could leave you bankrupt if you were not careful. So she was careful. She was so careful that she nearly missed it entirely. What she did not know, could not know in those golden October weeks, was that Micah Dawson carried a secret that had the potential to destroy everything, not because he was a dishonest man, but because he was a man who had been trapped by his own history in a way he had not yet found the words to explain. The secret had a name. The secret's name was Robert Hale. Robert Hale was the sheriff of a small county in Colorado, and 2 years before he rode onto the Shepard homestead, Micah Dawson had been the primary witness in a killing that Hale had committed in cold blood and subsequently tried to cover up. Micah had seen it happen. A man named Daniel Ortiz, a Mexican cattleman who had a legitimate claim to land that Hale wanted, had been shot dead in what Hale had reported as self-defense. Micah had been in the shadows of the alley when it happened. He had seen Hale shoot first. He had seen Ortiz fall without ever drawing his own weapon. He had gone to the county judge. The judge was Hale's brother-in-law. The case had been closed before it was opened. And then men had started following Micah Dawson. He had been running, not in the dramatic fashion of men in dime novels, but in the steady, methodical way of a man who understood that survival sometimes required constant movement. For 2 years by the time he limped his lame horse onto Dorothy Shepard's property. He had not told her this because he had not known in the beginning that he was going to stay long enough for it to matter. And then he had stayed longer, and it had mattered more, and the telling had become harder the longer he waited, until the secret had grown into something that felt like a betrayal even though it had not begun as one. 2 of Hale's men had arrived in Calder Creek in early November. Dorothy had heard about it from the proprietor of the general store, a man named Hoskins, who had told her as she was loading supplies into her wagon that 2 strangers were asking questions about a drifter matching Micah's description. Hoskins had the careful neutrality of a man who understood that information was currency in small towns, and was judiciously deciding whom to pay. Dorothy had driven home with her hands tight on the reins and a cold feeling in her stomach that was not quite fear and not quite anger but contained elements of both. She had asked Micah directly. She had waited until Clara was inside and the evening light was going, and she had walked up to where he was working on the fence post by the eastern paddock, and she had said, without preamble, that men were in town looking for him, and she needed to know what for. And Micah Dawson had looked at her with those complicated eyes, and he had made the worst decision of his time on the Shepard homestead. He had said it was nothing she needed to worry about. Dorothy had heard the evasion. She had heard the truth of his evasion, which was that there was something to worry about, and he was choosing not to tell her, and that choosing felt in the raw and bruised place where she had been slowly and carefully rebuilding her willingness to trust, like a trap closing. Like discovering that the ground she had been testing carefully for 4 years had a hidden weakness she had not been warned about. She had said things she did not entirely mean, in the way that people with deep reserves of fear sometimes say things they do not entirely mean when that fear is suddenly given a legitimate target. She had said that she had taken him in and given him work, and she deserved to know if she was harboring someone the law was looking for. She had said that she could not afford trouble, not on this land, not with her sister here, not after everything she had already survived. She had said, and this was the one she most regretted, that she did not know him at all and perhaps she had been a fool to let him stay. Micah had gone still and quiet in the way of a man receiving information he had been half expecting, and then he had said very quietly that she was right, that he was sorry for the trouble, and that he would be gone by morning. Dorothy had gone inside. She had lain awake listening to him move around in the barn where he slept, the sound small and final, and she had not come out. And in the morning his bedroll was gone and his horse was gone, and the only evidence that he had ever been there was the excellent fence line, and the tight new barn roof, and a strange, echoing absence that Dorothy felt in the center of her chest like a missing tooth the tongue cannot leave alone. She did not tell Clara what had happened. Clara figured it out in approximately 2 days, because Clara was not unintelligent, and she was not quiet about her opinion. She said that Dorothy had run off the best man to set foot on this property in 4 years, because Dorothy was more afraid of being hurt than she was willing to admit, and that she, Clara, found this both understandable and deeply frustrating. Dorothy had said she appreciated Clara's perspective and was not interested in discussing it further. That had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks during which Dorothy had worked harder than usual and slept less than usual and made every decision about the homestead with the deliberate, focused energy of a woman, refusing to think about the one thing she was thinking about constantly. 3 weeks during which she had woken in the night from dreams she would not allow herself to remember in the morning. 3 weeks during which she had replayed the conversation by the fence post 100 times, heard her own voice saying things that were true and things that were fear talking and things that were neither, and had not been able to separate them clearly enough to know what she would say differently. And then the carved wooden horse had appeared on the porch railing at dawn. And Dorothy Shepard had understood, in the way that people sometimes understand things that have been true for a while before they acknowledge them, that she was not done. That whatever was happening between herself and Micah Dawson, whatever complicated and risky and beautifully dangerous thing, had been growing in the weeks he had worked on her land and eaten at her table, and sat on her porch carving small, perfect animals in the evening light. That thing was not finished simply because she had been frightened and he had been proud, and they had both said insufficient words in a difficult moment. She also understood that men with secrets being hunted by other men did not leave carved horses on porches if they had simply moved on. They left those things when they were close, when they were waiting, when they had not quite given up, even if their pride required them to let the other person make the next move. Dorothy saddled her horse in the gray pre-dawn and rode east. She found him 3 miles from the homestead, camped in a dry creek bed where the cottonwoods were losing their leaves in long, amber curtains. He was sitting beside a small fire with his back against a tree trunk and his hat pulled down, and he had heard her coming long before she arrived because Micah Dawson was the kind of man who always heard things coming. He pushed the hat back and looked at her. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been hoping for something so intently that he had made himself stop hoping for it, and was now confronted with it unexpectedly, and was not quite certain the ground was real under his feet. Dorothy dismounted and tied her horse to a branch and stood at the edge of the firelight and looked at him. The carved wooden horse was in her coat pocket. She had brought it deliberately, a kind of wordless signal she had not been able to make verbal. She said, "I want to hear the whole truth, all of it, and then I will tell you what I decide." He had looked at her for a long moment in the firelight. Then he had said, "Sit down then, because it is going to take a while." She sat down, and Micah Dawson told her everything. He told her about Robert Hale and Daniel Ortiz and the alley in Colorado. He told it plainly, without theater, the way a man tells a true story, with the specific details that fiction does not bother with: the color of the sky that evening, the particular quality of the silence after the shot, the way Ortiz had looked at the stars for a moment before the light went from his eyes. He told her about going to the judge and finding the door already shut. He told her about the 2 years of careful movement, taking work when he found it and moving on when the feeling in his gut told him to, always one step ahead of men who were good at following. He told her that he had not planned to stay as long as he had on the Shepard homestead, that he had told himself every week that he should move on, that staying in one place was dangerous, and that the longer he stayed the worse it would be when he had to go. That he had kept finding reasons to stay one more week, because the work needed doing, and the horses needed tending, and there was always one more fence post or one more roof section that required attention. And he had understood clearly enough by the 3rd week that he was lying to himself about the reasons. He said that he had been afraid to tell her the truth because he had been afraid of exactly what had happened, that she would hear it as a betrayal of her trust rather than as the complicated product of a bad situation that had started before she was part of his life. He said quietly, looking at the fire rather than at her, "I was going to tell you. I want you to know that. I was working up to it. I ran out of time." Dorothy sat with all of this for a long moment. The fire crackled. A bird started up somewhere in the cottonwoods, confused by the hour. She said, "The 2 men in Calder Creek, where are they now?" He said he did not know for certain, but he had ridden wide around the town the previous day and he believed they had moved on, possibly following a false trail east. He said they were Hale's hired men, not lawmen with any legitimate authority, and that eventually, if the situation continued, it was going to need to be resolved in a way that was more permanent than running. Dorothy looked at him. She said, "What would resolving it look like?" And Micah explained that there was a federal land office in Amarillo and a federal circuit judge who had no connection to Hale, and that if he could get a formal statement documented before a federal officer, the kind of official testimony that could not simply be buried by a county judge with a conflict of interest, it might be enough to bring Hale up on charges that would make hunting Micah more trouble than it was worth. He said he had thought about this carefully over 2 years, and that it was the only solution he had found that did not require him to run forever or do something that would make him as bad as the man he was running from. Dorothy looked at the fire. She thought about James, who had been a good man and a safe choice, and who had died anyway, teaching her the lesson that safety is never quite as guaranteed as it appears. She thought about 4 years of loneliness, and 3 weeks of that loneliness being sharper and more specific than it had ever been before. She thought about the carved wooden horse in her pocket and what it had meant to her when she picked it up in the cold dawn before she had even opened the note. Just the fact of it, the fact that he had come back, that he had been close enough to leave it, that he had wanted her to know he was still there. She said, "How long would it take to get to Amarillo and back?" He looked at her sharply. He said, "You are not coming to Amarillo," she said. "I am not asking your permission. I am asking how long it would take." There was a silence. Then very carefully, as though he was testing the reality of what was happening, he said, 4 days, maybe 5, depending on the weather. Dorothy said, "Clara can manage the cattle for 5 days. She has done it before." He said her name. He said it carefully, like something valuable. He said Dorothy and then stopped. She said, "You left a horse on my porch. You know what you meant by that. I know what you meant by that. I am not interested in pretending otherwise. But I will not be someone you have to protect from your own life. I am not made of glass, and I have not survived what I have survived to be handled carefully by a man who thinks he is doing me a favor. If there is something to be done, we do it together. That is how this works if it works." Another silence, longer this time. An owl called somewhere in the dark. Micah Dawson looked at Dorothy Shepard across the fire in the creek bed at 4 in the morning in November of 1879 and said, "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known." Dorothy said, "I know. Are you going to argue with me about Amarillo or not?" He did not argue. They rode back to the homestead as the sun came fully up, painting everything that honey gold that the Texas panhandle does in the early morning, when the light comes in low and finds every blade of grass and makes the whole flat world shine. Dorothy explained to Clara over breakfast, speaking quickly and factually, and watching Clara's face move through surprise and concern and indignation and calculation, and finally land, as Clara's face usually did, on determination. Clara said that she could manage the cattle, that she had managed the cattle before, and that if Dorothy was going to ride to Amarillo with a man the law was not looking for but bad men were, Dorothy should at least take the rifle. She said all of this with the tone of a woman making practical assessments rather than objections, and Dorothy understood this as Clara's particular version of support, which had always expressed itself through competence rather than sentimentality. Then Clara looked at Micah across the breakfast table with the direct, appraising look that Dorothy remembered from the first night he had eaten there, and Clara said, "You should know that if you hurt my sister, the cattle will be the least of what you have to manage on this property." Micah said he understood completely. Clara nodded, satisfied, and asked if anyone wanted more coffee. They left the next morning in the gray pre-dawn, riding south and then west toward Amarillo with enough supplies for a week, and the rifle in Dorothy's saddle scabbard, and the carved wooden horse wrapped in cloth in Dorothy's saddlebag, because she could not quite bring herself to leave it behind. The ride to Amarillo took them 2 full days of steady travel, through country that was mostly flat and empty in the particular way of the Texas panhandle, grass and sky, and the occasional dark line of a river's cottonwoods breaking the horizon. The weather held clear and cold, with nights that dropped sharply and mornings that required patience with stiff fingers and reluctant fires. They talked, on those 2 days of riding, in a way that they had not quite managed during the weeks of his work on the homestead. There was something about movement, about the rhythm of horses and the open country stretching around them, that made talking easier, less loaded with the weight of whatever was or was not happening between them. Out here, with nowhere to go except forward and nothing to do except keep moving, conversation felt natural. Dorothy learned things. She learned that Micah had grown up in Missouri, in a town not far from where Clara had grown up, which Clara would later find both funny and faintly suspicious, though she would come to accept it. She learned that his father had been a carpenter and a farmer, and that Micah had learned his woodworking from him, the carving that made small things, birds and horses, and once a tiny fish for a child who had asked him for one. She learned that he had come west at 20 because the land called to him in the way it called to certain people, not the ones looking for fortune, but the ones looking for the sensation of being small against something enormous, and finding that smallness peaceful rather than frightening. She told him things she had not told many people. She told him about the winter after James died, when the loneliness had been so complete and so cold that she had wondered, genuinely and with a specificity that still frightened her to recall, whether she could continue. She told him that she had gotten through it by deciding one morning in February to simply do the next thing. Not the year, not the rest of her life, just the next thing: feed the horses, make breakfast, check the fence. Do the next thing and then the next, and build forward by inches until the inches accumulated into something. She told him that this approach had worked so well that she had applied it to everything, including her heart, and that the result was that she had become very competent and very organized and very much alone in a way that she had convinced herself was a choice rather than a consequence. Micah listened to all of this without interrupting or offering reassurances, and Dorothy found his silence more comforting than words would have been. He simply heard it, in the way that a man hears something he intends to remember. On the second evening, they camped by a creek south of Amarillo, and Micah built a fire and they ate beans and dried beef from their provisions. And afterward, Dorothy sat watching the fire while Micah took a piece of wood from his pack and began to carve. She watched his hands in the firelight, the small, careful movements, and she said, "What are you making?" He turned it to show her. It was just beginning to take shape, but she could see the curve of it, the suggestion of something reaching. He said, "A person running. Or maybe dancing. I have not decided yet which one it is." Dorothy said, "How do you know when you have decided?" He considered this seriously. He said, "Usually when I look at it and it tells me," she said. "And if it is running or dancing," he said, "then it is exactly what it needs to be." Dorothy looked at the fire. She said quietly, "I have been running for 4 years. I thought I was being careful. I think they might be the same thing sometimes." Micah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you might be right. I have been running too, for different reasons but the same motion." She said, "When does a person stop?" He looked up from the carving. He looked at her across the fire, and the look was direct and quiet and contained something that Dorothy felt in her chest like a chord struck cleanly. He said, "I think a person stops when they find something worth stopping for." Dorothy held his gaze. She said, "You left a horse on my porch at 4 in the morning before anyone was awake." He said, "Yes," she said. "That seems like a person who has stopped running," he said. "It seems that way to me too." They sat with that for a while, the fire between them, the enormous Texas sky overhead full of stars that were particular to November and to this latitude, dense and cold and brilliant. And then Dorothy did something she had not done in 4 years of careful self-management. She moved around the fire and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she did not say anything about it, and neither did he. After a while she leaned her head against his shoulder and felt his whole body go carefully, gratefully still beside her, the way a person goes still when they receive something they had stopped believing would come. They stayed like that until the fire burned low and the cold made further staying impractical, and Dorothy went to her bedroll and Micah went to his, and they said goodnight in voices that were different from the voices they had used before, quieter and more certain, carrying a weight of meaning that neither of them needed to define. Amarillo in November of 1879 was a rough, energetic town, expanding rapidly since the railroad had extended through the previous year, and every merchant and speculator within range had arrived to stake claims on the new commerce. It was loud and crowded and smelled of lumber and horse and new brick, and it moved at a pace that felt slightly feverish after the quiet open country of the ride-in. The Federal Land Office was a 2-story building on the main street, solid and official-looking, with a United States flag on a pole outside, and a clerk inside who had the expression of a man who did important things and wanted people to know it. Micah explained what he needed: the name of the federal circuit judge and the procedure for filing an official witness statement, and the clerk lost some of his affectations of importance and became quickly and genuinely helpful, because this was the sort of matter that a federal office was specifically designed to handle, and the clerk recognized it. The circuit judge, a man named Harlan Betts, was in town. This was luck, the kind that arrives after enough persistence that it starts to feel less like luck and more like the accumulated result of decisions made correctly. Judge Betts was a serious man in his 50s with a white mustache and the air of someone who had heard a great many things, and found that the true ones tended to be both stranger and more consistent than the invented ones. He listened to Micah's account of the Ortiz killing for 2 hours, asking precise questions and making careful notes in a ledger, and then he asked Micah to read back the statement and sign it. Micah signed it. Judge Betts said that the matter of Robert Hale would be referred to the United States Marshals Service, and that an investigation would be opened, formal and federal, which would supersede Hale's county authority entirely. He said that Micah's cooperation as a witness would be noted, and that his safety as a federal witness was now a matter of official concern. He said these things plainly and without drama, in the way of a man who knew the system and knew its limitations and was, within those limitations, doing his job with integrity. When they came out of the federal building onto the main street of Amarillo, Dorothy stood in the November sunlight and breathed, and the cold air tasted different than it had going in. Cleaner, maybe, lighter. Micah stood beside her on the boardwalk, and he looked different too. Some tension she had not quite consciously identified until now, something in the set of his jaw and the stillness in his hands had released. He looked like a man who had put down something heavy enough that it had become invisible to him simply through the necessity of carrying it. She said, "How does it feel?" He considered for a moment. Then he said, "Like a window being opened in a room that has been shut too long." She nodded. She understood that exactly. They spent one night in Amarillo in a boarding house, Dorothy in a room upstairs and Micah in a room down the hall, because they were both people of their era and their decency, and neither of them was willing to compromise what was building between them by rushing past its natural pace. But in the evening they had supper together in the boarding house dining room, at a small table by the window, and they talked until the proprietor started extinguishing the lamps in the other rooms, and they understood they had run out of evening. At the foot of the stairs, Micah said her name. He said Dorothy, and she turned, and he was looking at her with an expression so carefully honest that it stopped her breath. He said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that the answer you give is the right answer, whatever it is." She said, "Ask." He said, "When we get back to Calder Creek, when this is settled, I would like to stay, not as hired labor, not as temporary. I would like to stay and see whether what I think is happening between us is what I think it is, and if it is, I would like to figure out what comes next. But I will only stay if you ask me to. I will not presume." Dorothy stood on the stairs of the Amarillo boarding house in November 1879 and looked at Micah Dawson, and she thought about all the running she had done, 4 years of it, very fast in very small circles, and she thought about the carved wooden horse in her saddlebag mid-gallop with all 4 hooves off the ground, and she thought about what he had said by the fire, that a person stops running when they find something worth stopping for. She said, "I am asking you to stay." He smiled then. She had seen him smile before, small and controlled, the cautious version. This was different. This reached all the way to those complicated eyes and made them simple for a moment, just happy, plainly and wholly happy, and it transformed his face in a way that Dorothy suspected she would see clearly every time she closed her eyes for the rest of her life. She went upstairs. He stood at the bottom of the stairs watching her until she turned at the landing, and they said good night, and neither of them slept particularly well, but for a different reason than before. The ride back to the homestead took 2 days in the other direction, and the country looked different going east, or perhaps they looked different at it. The sky seemed larger. The grass had a gold depth to it that Dorothy did not remember noticing on the way out. The cold was the same cold, but it seemed to settle differently, less as a thing to endure and more as a quality of the air, clean and specific to this season and this latitude. They talked more on the way back, and laughed more too, in a way they had not quite managed before because there had been too much weight on everything. Micah told stories about the different places and kinds of work he had found in his 2 years of moving, some of them genuinely funny, and Dorothy found that his humor was dry and quiet, and often arrived so late after the setup that she had almost moved past the moment before she caught it. And then the laughing caught up with her, and she felt it all the way down. He asked her about James, and she told him, and he listened with the particular quality of attention that she had noticed from the beginning, fully present without pressing. And when she was done, he said simply that James sounded like a good man, and that it made sense she had loved him. He said it without complication or jealousy, just as a true thing, and Dorothy felt another small wall come down somewhere in the interior of herself that she had not quite known was still standing. They arrived back at the homestead on a Friday evening to find Clara entirely in control of everything, the cattle accounted for, and the evening chores done, and a pot of beef stew on the stove that smelled extraordinary after 4 days of trail rations. Clara looked at them when they came through the door, looked at the way they moved together in the comfortable, slightly orbital way of two people who have recalibrated their understanding of each other, and Clara said, "I see the trip was productive." Dorothy said, "We filed a federal witness statement. An investigation has been opened." Clara said, "I am delighted to hear it. Sit down, both of you." She did not say anything else about it that evening. She did not need to. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of the homestead changed in a small but significant way. Micah Dawson was still there, and he still worked hard, and he still carved things in the evenings on the porch. But the quality of his presence was different now, settled in a way it had not been before. And Dorothy moved through her days differently too, with a lightness that Clara noticed, and that Dorothy did not try to explain or minimize. There was a slowness to what developed between them that was not the slowness of reluctance, but the slowness of people who have learned to be careful, and are learning, gradually, that some things are worth uncaging from carefulness. Micah would find reasons to work near wherever Dorothy was working, not crowding but adjacent, and sometimes their hands would be close together on a task, and the nearness would be a kind of conversation. He carved her another thing, a longer and more complex piece, a pair of horses running together across a small plain he had suggested in the wood, and he left it on the kitchen table one morning without comment, and Dorothy picked it up and held it in her hands for a long time before she set it on the shelf above the fireplace where it would stay for the rest of both their lives. The news from Colorado came in December, delivered in the form of a letter from the federal judge's office in Amarillo. The United States Marshal's Service had opened a formal investigation into Robert Hale. Hale had, upon learning of the investigation, resigned his position as county sheriff. The letter was official and dry, and contained between its formal lines the plain fact that a corrupt man had been removed from a position of power. He had used to protect himself from the consequences of killing an innocent man, and that this had been accomplished without violence and without compromise, through the kind of institutional process that was slow and frustrating but also real. And Dorothy thought about Daniel Ortiz, whom she had never met and never would, and felt a complicated grief for him that she thought Micah shared. She showed Micah the letter. He read it twice. He was quiet for a long while after. Then he said, "For Daniel," and Dorothy said yes, for Daniel. Hale's hired men never came back to Calder Creek. Without a paymaster with a reason to fund the hunt simply stopped. And Micah Dawson was no longer a man who had to watch the road behind him. There was a Sunday in December, 10 days before Christmas, when Dorothy and Micah rode into Calder Creek together for supplies, and he helped her carry flour sacks to the wagon, and the proprietor Hoskins looked at them with the particular look of a man who has been watching a situation develop, and is now receiving confirmation of his assessment, and said something bland and friendly about the cold weather. On the way home, Dorothy said that she supposed the town would have opinions. Micah said that towns always had opinions. She said, "Does that bother you?" He looked at her sideways from his horse and said, "Does it bother you?" She considered it. She said, "No. I have been managing the opinions of Calder Creek for 4 years. I expect I can continue," he said. "Then it does not bother me at all." They rode the 12 miles back in companionable silence, and when they came up the ridge that gave the first view of the homestead in the late afternoon light, the land spread below them in that particular way it had sometimes, when the angle of the sun made everything look illuminated from underneath. The barn and the house and the fence lines and the cattle in the south pasture, and all of it resting in the enormous quiet of the panhandle evening. And Dorothy felt, with a completeness that surprised her, that she was happy, not the careful, hard-won contentment she had managed for 4 years, something fuller than that. Something that had weight and warmth and depth and was not frightening at all. She said, without quite planning to, "I am glad you left the horse on the porch." Micah looked at her, and the smile came, the full one, the one that reached his eyes. He said, "So am I." Christmas came. Clara made something ambitious with dried apples and molasses that was nominally a cake and functionally a celebration of survival and good humor. Micah contributed a small carved nativity scene that he placed on the mantel beside Dorothy's 2 horses, and which Clara declared was the finest thing she had seen outside of a proper church, and which she may have been slightly exaggerating, but only slightly. They ate together and talked late into the evening, all 3 of them around the table, and Dorothy looked at the faces of the 2 people in that room, her sister and this man who had come from nowhere and was becoming, quietly and irrevocably, something central. And she felt the holiday not as a ceremony, but as a genuine marking of something real. In January, Micah asked Dorothy to walk with him after supper, which was not unusual. They had taken to walking the property fence line in the evenings when the cold allowed it. But he stopped at the eastern fence, the fence he had repaired in that first week, and turned to face her in the thin winter moonlight, and Dorothy could see from the particular stillness of his face that what was coming was something he had been carrying for a while. He said, "I need to ask you something else. And again the answer you give is the right one." She said, "You can just ask, Micah. You do not have to preface it every time." He said, "I am going to be nervous about this one specifically." She said, "Then ask it anyway." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out something small. He had made it himself. She could see that immediately, a ring fashioned from copper wire twisted into a careful, deliberate pattern, simple and strong, with a small carved wooden bead set at the center. It was not a purchased ring from a jeweler. It was not that kind of ring. It was the kind of thing a man made with his own hands when he meant to give something of himself along with the asking. He said, "I know I am a drifter with a complicated past, and not much to my name, except what I can make with my hands and what I can earn with my work. I know you have built something real here, and I am not asking to take it from you or change it or run it for you, because I have seen how you run it and you do not need help with that. I am asking if you would be willing to let me be part of it, if you would be willing to let me stay, not temporarily, properly, as your husband if you will have me." Dorothy looked at the copper ring in the moonlight. She looked at Micah's face, serious and open, and wearing that quality of honest vulnerability that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him, and that she had been noticing ever since. She looked at the fence line he had built, straight and solid in the moonlight, and at the dark shape of the barn with its tight new roof section, and at the house where Clara was probably watching from a window and would be impossible to live with if Dorothy came home wearing a ring. She said, "Yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it in the thin January moonlight, and it was the most right thing she had worn in 4 years. She was going to say something else, but he kissed her, finally, gently, with a care that was neither cautious nor hesitant, but rather precise, the way he did most things, and Dorothy kissed him back with 4 years of careful, accumulated longing that turned out to have been waiting for exactly this. And the January night was cold, but the cold was entirely beside the point. They were married in March in Calder Creek, at the small Methodist church that had been established 3 years before by a minister named Pastor Collins, who had opinions about most things, and the sense to keep them mostly to himself when the occasion called for it. Clara served as witness and cried in the way that Clara always did when she was moved, not delicately but thoroughly, with her chin up and her eyes bright, and no apology for any of it. Hoskins from the general store attended, as did most of Calder Creek, because a wedding was a public event in 1880, and also because Dorothy Shepard was a woman the town had respected for 4 years, and they were prepared to extend that respect to her choice of husband, particularly as he had demonstrated over the winter months a consistent competence and character that was difficult to argue with. Dorothy wore a blue dress, not the white of formal tradition which was expensive and impractical, but a particular deep blue that she had made herself over the winter, stitched at the collar with small white flowers that Clara had embroidered in the evenings. She carried a bunch of early wild flowers. She walked into the church on her own feet, alone, as she had walked into most of the last 4 years, and she walked up the aisle and stood beside Micah Dawson, and they said words to each other in front of witnesses that meant the same thing the copper ring had already meant, that this was real, that this was permanent, that this was chosen. After the ceremony there was a gathering at the Shepard homestead, because Clara had organized it, because Clara organized things she cared about with the same determination she brought to everything, and people brought food and someone produced a fiddle, and the afternoon became a party that went on until the stars came out, and the cold chased the last of the guests home. Micah danced with Dorothy in the kitchen after everyone was gone, slow and quiet with Clara laughing at them from the doorway, and Dorothy thought that this was what she had not let herself believe in for 4 years, not the ceremony or the party or the fiddle, but this, the very specific ordinariness of standing in her own kitchen with someone's arms around her, and the sense of a future that felt not frightening but wide open. That spring they planted more of the kitchen garden and Clara built a new chicken coop, and Micah began a project that Dorothy had not known about until she found him one Saturday morning in the barn surrounded by lumber, and she asked what he was making, and he said, with a particular economy of expression that she had come to love, that the house needed another room. She said, "Why does the house need another room?" He looked at her with those gray-green eyes and said nothing. Dorothy's face went warm. She said, "Oh," he said, "not immediately, but I thought it was better to build it properly rather than quickly." She said, "You might be the most practical man alive." He said, "I prefer to think of it as optimistic." Clara said, from outside where she had been listening through the barn door and not even slightly pretending otherwise, "I think he is both." The summer of 1880 was long and hot, and the cattle work was relentless in the particular way of Texas summers, but it was also good work, shared work, and there was a difference in the quality of hard days when they were shared. Dorothy had learned this and was still learning the scope of it. Micah worked beside her with the same steady, uncomplaining energy he brought to everything, and in the evenings he carved and she mended or read or sat on the porch watching the sky go through its colors, and the evenings were full of the quiet that is full rather than empty. In the autumn they got a letter from Colorado. It came through the federal judge's office in Amarillo, forwarded to them from there. It informed Micah that the formal investigation into Robert Hale had resulted in Hale being charged under federal statute with the killing of Daniel Ortiz, and that a trial was scheduled for the spring of 1881. Micah would be asked to provide testimony, which could be done by written affidavit given the signed statement already on record, unless he chose to travel to provide it in person. Micah read the letter and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I would like to go, to give the testimony in person. I think Daniel Ortiz deserves a witness who looks the court in the eye." Dorothy said, "Then we will go." He looked at her. She said, "That is how this works, remember," he said. "You are extraordinary." She said, "You keep saying that. I keep agreeing with you." They went to Colorado in March of 1881, leaving the homestead in Clara's absolutely capable hands, and traveling north and west through country that was by now becoming more settled than it had been when Micah first crossed it as a fugitive. The railroad reached more places. The towns were filling in. The open country was being parceled and claimed with the relentless and not always careful energy of a nation still in the act of becoming. The trial of Robert Hale was held in a federal courtroom in Pueblo, Colorado, and Micah sat in the witness chair and told what he had seen in that alley 2 years before, clearly and specifically and without embellishment, the same account he had given Dorothy by a creek bed fire, and the same account he had given to Judge Betts in Amarillo. He told it looking at the court and the jury and once, briefly, at Robert Hale, who had aged in 2 years in the way of men who carry guilt that is too heavy for their character to support. The jury found Hale guilty after 2 days of deliberation. He was sentenced to 15 years at the federal penitentiary. It would not bring Daniel Ortiz back. It would not give his family the land that Hale had wanted. But it meant that the law had, finally, with slowness and difficulty, and the intervention of correct institutional forces, done the thing it was theoretically supposed to do. Outside the courthouse, in the cold March air of Pueblo, Colorado, Micah stood on the steps and Dorothy stood beside him, and he looked at something in the middle distance for a long moment without speaking. She put her hand in his and he held it and they stood there quietly until the cold became insistent. She said, "Are you all right?" He said, "I think so. I think I will need a day or two to know for certain." She said, "We have time." He said, "Yes, we do." They rode home to Texas through April, and the country was spring now, the grass coming up new, and the sky doing that particular thing it does in spring on the plains, enormous and layered with clouds and light in a way that seems almost operatic after the flat white of winter. They took their time. They were not running anymore, either of them, and the luxury of not running allowed them to see the country in a way that rushing through it had not permitted. They came home to the homestead on a Thursday afternoon in late April, and Clara came out from the barn with a smudge of dirt on her face and her hair coming down, and what appeared to be a newborn calf behind her, and she said, "I was hoping you would be back today. This one came early and I have been managing alone since Tuesday and I am not complaining, but I would like my sister back." Dorothy dismounted and hugged her sister hard and said, "We are back." Clara said, "Good. Now someone else can deal with that calf." The calf was fine. Everything was fine. By the summer of 1881, the room Micah had built onto the house in the spring of 1880 had become necessary, because Dorothy was expecting a child, and she was expecting it with a mixture of joy and the particular anxiety of a woman who has known loss and is aware of how much there is to lose. But she was also, she told Micah one evening on the porch with the summer stars coming out, genuinely happy, not the careful kind, the full kind. He said, "I am too, genuinely." She said, "I know, that is still remarkable to me sometimes." He said, "To me too." The baby arrived in October of 1881, born on a Tuesday morning with Dr. Fletcher, who had set up a proper practice in Calder Creek the previous year, in attendance. It was a boy, and he came into the world with a determination and volume that suggested he had strong opinions about having arrived, and Micah held him with the particular stunned tenderness of a man receiving something larger than he had quite prepared for. They named him James Micah Dawson. James, for the good and solid man Dorothy had loved before. Micah, because the man holding him had earned that too. Clara held him next and said he was the most excellent baby she had ever seen, and she said it with the conviction of someone who had not been around many babies, but was completely prepared to be an authority on this one. She took to being an aunt with the same intensity she brought to everything. And James Micah Dawson was going to grow up knowing exactly how loved he was, which is the kind of knowledge that shapes a person from the beginning in ways that cannot be undone. Life on the homestead in 1882 was fuller and louder than it had been, and harder in specific ways, the way that life with a young child is harder, the broken sleep and the constant attention, and the way that small crises arrive without warning and require immediate management. But it was also richer in a way that Dorothy, even in her best careful years, had not quite known to anticipate. She watched Micah with their son. She watched him carry the baby against his chest in the early mornings, while she slept an extra hour, a thing he had begun doing without being asked, just appearing in the mornings to take the baby so she could rest. She watched him sit with James in the barn while he did the horsework, talking quietly to the child about what he was doing, explaining the horses and the tack and the grain with a patient seriousness that treated the baby as a person capable of understanding even though he was months from being able to respond. She watched him carve small things for the baby, the beginning of a set of carved animals that James Micah Dawson would carry with him his whole life. She thought sometimes about the carved wooden horse on the porch railing, the one that had brought her out into the cold dawn to saddle her horse, the one that was still on the shelf above the fireplace next to the two running horses, the one that had started everything being honest. She thought about what it meant that a man chose to say the thing he could not quite say in words by leaving something beautiful in the dark before anyone was awake. She thought he was still doing it. Every morning when he rose before her and took the baby, every evening when he came in from work and found where she was before he did anything else. Every small thing he made with his hands that was actually a way of saying something about love without requiring the words to be adequate. Clara announced in the spring of 1882 that she had been corresponding with a man in Missouri, a farmer named Edward Park, whose family had been known to the Shepard family for years, and that she had decided she was going to go back to Missouri and marry him. She said this at the breakfast table with the directness that was entirely characteristic of Clara, and then she looked at Dorothy and said, "Do not make me feel guilty about this." Dorothy said, "I am not going to make you feel guilty about this. I am going to miss you enormously." Clara said, "I know. I am going to miss you too, but you have what you need here, and I have been waiting a long time to have it myself." Dorothy stood up from the table and went around and hugged her sister, and they held on for a long moment, the way sisters hold on when they are not going to be in the same place for a long time, which is differently from other hugs with a different quality of grip. Micah said, "If he is anything less than what you deserve, Clara, we expect a letter." Clara said, "You will be the first to know." Clara left for Missouri in May, and the homestead was quieter without her in a way that was not quite loneliness but was its own kind of adjustment. Dorothy missed her sister in the specific, physical way of missing someone who has been in the same space for a long time, turning to say something and finding the space empty, hearing a sound and expecting Clara's voice, and hearing instead the particular quiet of two adults and a baby who is just beginning to be interested in motion. The letters came regularly. Clara married Edward Park in June of 1882 and said he was good and kind, and the farm was fine and Missouri was wetter than Texas, and she did not miss the heat even slightly. Dorothy wrote back that they were all well and James was walking, and Micah had added a new pasture fence, and she missed Clara every single day and was also deeply and completely happy. She was. This was the fact that still surprised her, not the happiness itself, because she had been taught by 4 years of hard work and one man with a knife and a piece of cottonwood that happiness was possible, but the depth and the constancy of it. It was not the kind of happiness that came and went with circumstances. It was the kind that was structural, built into the bones of the life she and Micah were making, as solid and carefully constructed as the new fence line or the additional room he had built with his own hands. In the evenings when James was asleep and the work was done, they would sit on the porch, sometimes talking and sometimes not, and the prairie would do what it did in the evenings, fill with cricket sound and the smell of dry grass and the enormous Texas dark coming down from above, and Dorothy would lean against her husband's shoulder and he would put his arm around her, and it would be entirely ordinary and entirely miraculous at the same time. By 1883, James Micah Dawson was walking with the determined wobbliness of a 2-year-old who has very strong opinions about where he wants to go and insufficient coordination to get there as efficiently as he would like. He was dark-haired like Dorothy and had something around the eyes and the set of the jaw that was unmistakably Micah. and he was already showing an interest in the carved animals on the shelf that his father observed with a quiet pleasure he did not make theatrical. One evening Dorothy found Micah sitting with James on his lap in the barn, the lantern light warm and golden, and Micah had a small piece of wood and the folding knife, and he was showing James, very slowly, how the knife moved along the grain of the wood. James was watching with the complete absorption of a child encountering something genuinely wondrous, and Micah was explaining in the same low, patient voice he used with the horses, talking about following the wood, about finding what shape it already contained and helping it appear. Dorothy stood in the barn doorway and watched this, and felt something move through her that was so large she did not have a word for it. Not happiness, or not only happiness, something older than that, something that the human heart has been reaching toward for as long as there have been human hearts, this exact thing, this lamplit moment of a father's hands and a child's attention and the smell of wood shavings and the particular quality of peace that comes from being exactly where you are supposed to be. She went back to the house without interrupting them. Some moments are complete without addition. Clara wrote in the fall of 1883 to say that she was expecting her first child in the spring, and that she and Edward were very happy, and that the farm in Missouri was doing well. Dorothy wrote back with instructions, advice, and love in roughly equal measure, and thought about how lives branch, how a single choice or a single morning or a single carved horse on a porch railing can redirect the whole trajectory of what comes after, all the way out to the edges of things that have not happened yet. The homestead continued to grow in the careful, incremental way of things that are built to last. By 1884, they had 60 head of cattle and a second pasture, and a proper root cellar that Micah had dug and lined with stone over the course of a summer, working in the cool of the mornings before the heat became serious. James Micah Dawson was 3 years old and had opinions about everything, and a laugh that his father said he could hear from the far pasture. That Christmas, Dorothy found on her pillow a small carved figure that she recognized immediately as herself, or a version of herself, the posture unmistakably hers, standing and looking at something in the distance with her chin up and her shoulders set in the particular way she stood when she was making a decision. It was the most intimate thing anyone had ever made for her, and she held it in her hands for a long time, and then she went and found Micah in the barn and she said, "You see me?" He said, "Yes." She said, "You have been seeing me this whole time." He said, "Yes." She did not say anything else. She put her arms around him and held on, and he held her, and the December cold was outside and the barn was warm and their son was sleeping in the house, and the carved horse was on the shelf above the fireplace, and the copper ring was on her finger, and none of it was going away. In the spring of 1885, Dorothy told Micah she was expecting again, their second child, and he received this news with the same stunned, grateful tenderness he had brought to the first time, which she found both characteristic and affecting. He held her hands and looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had been looking into for 6 years now, and that still sometimes caught her off guard with what they contained. She said, "Are you happy?" He said, "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life, by a significant distance." She said, "Good. So am I." The second baby arrived in October of 1885, a girl this time, born in the same room as her brother with the same Dr. Fletcher in attendance and the same October light coming through the window. She was born with a full head of dark red hair that nobody could entirely account for, and a quiet alertness that made her seem, from the first hours of her life, like someone who was paying careful and serious attention to everything around her. They named her Clara Rose Dawson, for the aunt in Missouri who cried when the letter arrived and wrote back immediately with the kind of reply that is entirely illegible from emotion and entirely understood in spite of that. James Micah Dawson, aged 4, inspected his new sister with the critical attention of a child who has been the only child for his entire conscious life and is now being asked to revise this understanding of the world. He told his father that she was very small. Micah confirmed this. James said that she did not do anything. Micah said that she would, given time. James considered this and said that he supposed that was acceptable. Life settled into a new shape, the particular shape of a household with 2 small children, which is louder and more complicated and also more joyful than the household before, in the specific way that complexity sometimes equals richness. Dorothy watched her family in those years with a quality of attention that was itself a form of gratitude. She had known what it was to feel alone in the world and also what it was to choose to close herself off from connection, and she knew therefore the value of what she had now with a precision that people who had never been without it could not quite access. She was not naive about it. She did not pretend the hard days were not hard. The frontier in the 1880s was still a difficult and demanding place, still required everything a person had on a regular basis, and Dorothy still had mornings when the work piled up and the children were restless, and the cattle needed attention, and the weather was doing something inconvenient. And on those mornings she was tired and sometimes short-tempered and entirely human. But underneath the hard days was the structural happiness she had been building since that cold November morning, when she saddled her horse and rode east toward a creek bed and a small fire, and a man with complicated eyes who had left her a carved wooden horse before anyone else was awake. That horse still sat on the shelf above the fireplace, in the company of all the other things Micah had made over the years. The 2 running horses, the figure of Dorothy herself, a small bird for Clara, now matched by a second bird made and sent to Missouri, a set of farm animals for James, a tiny sleeping creature for Clara Rose, her name Peace, that she kept beside her bed, and the small figure he had been carving by the fire on their second night of the ride to Amarillo, the one he had said was either a person running or a person dancing, and that he had finished and given to Dorothy, and that she had looked at for a long time before saying, "I think it is dancing." He had said, "I think you are right. It was dancing. Everything, eventually, was dancing." In the summer of 1887, a letter arrived from the federal judge's office in Amarillo, forwarded through Calder Creek. It informed them that Robert Hale had died in the federal penitentiary of a fever in the winter of 1886, 7 years into his 15-year sentence. It also noted that the Ortiz family, through the intervention of the federal land proceedings that had followed the case, had recovered a portion of the land that Daniel Ortiz had originally held claim to, and that his widow and children were established there. Micah read the letter twice. Then he went out to the barn for a while, and Dorothy let him have the time, because she understood by now the topography of his silences, which ones were simple quiet and which ones were processing things that needed space, and this was the second kind. When he came back and he said, "I am glad about the land. I am glad his family has something real to stand on." Dorothy said, "Yes," he said, "and I am done with it, completely done. It does not live inside me any more the way it did." She said, "Good." He said, "I think the word for what I feel is free." She said, "Yes, I know exactly what that feels like," and she did. She had found it herself, that feeling, in the years since she had stopped running in very small circles and started building something instead. It was not the freedom of having no attachments, which she had once confused with freedom. It was the other kind, the kind that comes from choosing your life fully, from knowing who you are and who you love and what land you stand on and what your hands are building, and feeling the absolute rightness of the whole thing, the way a well-made joint feels right, or a roof that will hold through any winter, or a carving that looks at you and tells you exactly what it is. James Micah Dawson turned 8 in 1889 and showed every sign of becoming a young man with his father's hands and his mother's mind, which was a combination Dorothy privately thought was excellent. He had his own folding knife now, a small one purchased carefully from the store in Calder Creek on his 7th birthday, and he spent hours in the barn with his father, learning the carving, learning which wood was soft enough for beginning and which had a stronger grain that required more patience, learning to follow the wood rather than force it. Clara Rose was 4 and was already very clear on who she was, which was a person of significant dignity and strong preferences, and who was going to do things in her own time at her own pace with her own assessment of how they should be done, which Dorothy recognized with a mixture of amusement and recognition as qualities that had not arrived in the child from nowhere. Clara in Missouri wrote every month. She had 2 children of her own, a boy named Thomas and a girl named Mary, and Edward Park was a good husband and a good farmer, and the letters from Missouri had the tone of a woman who had made right choices and was living inside them with satisfaction, and the occasional complaint about Missouri weather, which Clara found personally offensive even now. In the spring of 1890, Dorothy and Micah rode to Calder Creek together as they did most weeks for supplies, and Micah tied the horses at the post and held his hand out to help Dorothy down from her horse, as he always did, and she took it, as she always did, and when she was down they stood close for a moment in the spring sunlight on the main street of a town they had been part of for over a decade, and someone passing by said good morning to them both by name, to Mr. and Mrs. Dawson, and Dorothy thought about the woman she had been before, the one who had sat in the chair by the window all night listening to the prairie wind, and she found that woman distant and comprehensible and dear to her in the way that you can be dear to an earlier version of yourself when you understand what they were carrying. Micah looked at her and said, "You are 1,000 miles away," she said. "I was thinking about the day you left the horse on the porch." He said, "What about it?" She said, "I was thinking about who I was that morning, and who I am now." He said, and she said, "And I am grateful for the horse, for following you east, for all of it." He said, "So am I every single day." She said, "Even the hard days." He said, "Especially the hard days. The hard days are proof that the life is real." She looked at him, this man she had loved for 11 years now, who had arrived on her property trailing dust and a complicated past, and a wound on his jaw he had forgotten about, who had built her a fence and a roof section and an extra room, and carved her horses and dancing figures, and held their children with hands that were careful and capable, and his entire self, who had become the absolute center of a life she had built, and that he had joined, and that they had continued to build together. Every day, by inches, the way she had once gotten through winter by doing the next thing, and then the next. She said, "Let us go get the flour and go home." He said, "Let us." They went home to the homestead, to the children and the cattle and the kitchen garden and the porch with its view of the enormous Texas sky, and the shelf above the fireplace where the carved horse still stood, mid-gallop with all 4 hooves off the ground, frozen in that perpetual moment of freedom, and the dancing figure beside it, and all the small, careful, beautiful things that accumulated over years when a person chooses to stop running and start building. And the life they had made was real and warm and solid and full, and it was exactly what it was supposed to be, and it was going to go on. Dorothy Shepard Dawson sat on her porch the evening of that spring day in 1890 and watched the sky go through its sunset colors, the rose and the gold and the deep blue coming in from the east, and she held the carved wooden horse in her hand, the first one, the small cottonwood horse with the leather-tied note that had been the beginning of everything, and she thought, "This is what it looks like when you open the window." The air that came in was not always easy, but it was real, and it was hers. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear Micah's voice and James's voice and Clara Rose's high particular laugh, and the sounds of the evening settling over the house and the land, the way it had settled for years now, the way it would settle tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days they were building toward, one at a time, with their hands and their hearts and the particular stubborn courage of 2 people who had once been running and had chosen, against the considerable weight of their own histories, to stop. The sun went down over the Texas panhandle, and the stars came out, billions of them, the same stars that had hung over the dry creek bed and the fire and the 2 horses grazing nearby on the night that everything became possible, And Dorothy Shepard Dawson breathed in the cool spring air and was grateful down to the bone for every single thing that had brought her here.